Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the tussle between the central government and WhatsApp and the glaring contradictions in two cases that are filed against them. We also take a quick look at the Madhya Pradesh government getting a notice from the High Court regarding incidents of communal violence. But first, we talk about the Indian economy. Last week, the Reserve Bank of India, that is the RBI, announced the results of its latest consumer confidence survey that was conducted in May. This survey essentially seeks to find out what people feel about the economy and the current situation. For this, the survey asks questions to households in 13 major cities in India. In this segment, Udit Mishra, who writes on the economy for the Indian Express, joins us to talk about the results of the survey, the big takeaways from it, and its significance. So, Udit, RBI recently published the results of its consumer confidence survey that was conducted in May. So, before we talk about the results, could you first explain what exactly this survey does?
So RBI regularly, every 2 months, as it revisits the monetary policy stance, it also continues to conduct a whole host of surveys. And the idea behind those surveys is to understand how's the economy improving or performing, what are the issues emerging. So it surveys consumers, it surveys professional forecasters, it surveys the companies, the firms in the industry, to figure out what is happening, because RBI's monetary policy takes into account all these inputs to determine what should be the level of money supply and what pricing of money supply should be there. By pricing, we mean the interest rate. So the survey that we have talked about came out last week, which was mainly focused on the consumer sentiments.
And one of the things that this survey tells us is how people are viewing their current situation and how they are viewing the economy. And I just wanted to understand, why is that important? Why is it important for the RBI to know how people view things?
So the reason why it's important to know is that ultimately how people perceive the economic situation and the different variables also determines their economic behavior. And their economic behavior will determine many of the variables that RBI is trying to target. So for example, if we look at inflation, RBI is legally mandated to keep inflation rate between 2 and 6%, the retail inflation. And if you back calculate, that inflation will depend on how people view the economic situation, how people's incomes are changing, or how people think their incomes are changing, how people see the price level increasing, the rate at which is increasing, which is the inflation rate. So, because consumers' behavior depends on what consumers perceive or what are their sentiments about their economic scenario, that is why it is so important for RBI to assess how people feel, and not just feel in relation to, say, a year ago, but also how they feel in relation to what they feel that things are going to be a year ahead. And mostly there are these things that people think that things will improve a year ahead. And sometimes, as we found this time, people are pessimistic about things not improving in a year ahead.
So, could you talk about the results of this survey in more detail? What has it revealed this time?
So, broadly, there are two indices that are generally talked about when we talk about the summary results from the consumer survey. One is the current situation index, and the other is future expectation index. Now, very simply put, current situation index is an index trying to gauge how people feel they are on several economic variables when compared to a year ago. So, for example, do they think that the general economic situation in the country is better than what it was a year ago? Or do they think that price level is lower or higher than a year ago? Do they think that their incomes have improved or worsened since a year ago? And this whole set of individual variables then go into making the current situation index. And it gives you a sentiment, an understanding of how the people's sentiment is at present. And it is this exact thing which has fallen to an all-time low according to the RBI survey. And the other thing is the future expectation index, and which is essentially just going, instead of going back, asking people how they feel on the same economic variables, how they think things will be in a year's time. So what are their future expectations? And that gives you a sentiment of how people are feeling, how hopeful they are, how confident they are that the situations will improve or worsen. And that also gives a very good understanding to RBI about what they need to do.
So, just to recap, according to this survey, how people are viewing their current situation vis a vis a year ago, that's come to an all time low. And how people are expecting the future to be, what things will be like a year from now, that is also really low. So, do we know the exact reasons why these two indices are low?
Yes. So, in terms of, say, the current situation index, so basically why people are feeling this is such a bad time, there are two factors in particular. I mean, if you look at different variables, as I've explained in that explain speaking piece, there are different variables which are all showing a downward trend, but there were two variables in particular that really pulled down the overall index, which was how people saw the general economic situation, that is, quote unquote, general economic situation, and the employment scene. So these were the two things that really pulled down the current situation index. To just go in quickly into the detail, on the general economic situation, what we find is that the data shows that since Mr. Modi took over in his second term in 2019, that graph of how people perceive the general economic situation, that has been plummeting very sharply. It has just not seen any increase. It has just been steadily declining, and not even steadily, quite sharply. And that holds true also for future expectations. So since 2019, when he took over, the future expectations of also on general economic situation have been plummeting. On employment, it has been the worst thing, and we have talked about this in the previous episodes also, that employment perceptions on, or how people view employment scene at the current juncture, is a graph which has been going down since Mr. Modi took over in 2014. And that's a line almost of a secular decline again. It has just sharpened further after 2019 when he took over in the second term.
And, apart from these two reasons, the general economic situation and unemployment, there is another reason that you write in your piece that is bringing these two indices down, which is people's outlook on incomes. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yes. So even on incomes, that is again another question that is asked, whether your incomes have improved over the last year or not, or have they worsened, and whether you think that incomes will improve in a year's time, or will they worsen. And again, we see that since 2014, when he took over, the graph has been of a steady decline. And after the pandemic hit, it just fell. It just fell off the cliff. It has just plummeted to a tremendously low level, and which is understandable after the pandemic. And before the pandemic, as we have mentioned, the decline in economic activity, in any case, since 2014, 15, or 16, 17, more in particular, that has been showing up in the incomes of the people. So people are realizing that their incomes are not going up, or they are not as much as they were a year ago. And that is showing up in the indices.
Okay, so looking at these findings, what is the big takeaway that we come out with?
So, see, the big thing is that apart from the fact that we've seen that employment expectations are coming down, or perception is coming down, income perception is coming down, inflation or price level expectations continue to be really hard. They expect prices to remain high. What we also find is that since the pandemic hit, or even before that, roughly around 2018 onwards, spending on non essential items, a vacation or a luxury item, or anything that can be avoided, has been coming down. And in a nutshell, what that shows is that it comes back to the basic problem that we are facing in the government's approach. The government has basically said that the private sector will lead us out of this crisis. It will invest, create new jobs, those jobs will create incomes for others, and the economy will prosper. Now, the problem is that because what all these surveys are finding is that people are holding back their spending, and they're holding back their spending, especially on non-essential items, and which is very important because they need to spend. If people do not spend on non-essential, if they get so strict about their spending, then there will not be enough demand. If there will not be enough demand, then the idea that private sector will invest and create new capacities and create new jobs, that will not happen. And if that doesn't happen, then it will again feed into the cycle where people do not have as much money, or their incomes are restricted, and the demand will continue to flounder. So this is essentially the tricky challenge facing the economy. a lot of people have said that the government should intervene because there is no other way to break this vicious cycle.
And I suppose that is the origin of this problem, that for people to spend on non essential items, their incomes will have to increase. And we talked about this in our last podcast as well, which was the importance for the government to incentivize businesses that are more labor intensive, as in that employ more people, than businesses that are more capital intensive, right?
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, we need to relook at the way we go about incentivizing some of the industries that we are incentivizing and figure out, as I've mentioned in many of the pieces that I've been writing, that it's not just a matter of GDP growth. Yes, GDP need higher GDP growth, but if only 10 people in the economy make money, that will not help the rest of the country. We need to figure out a way in which we grow in a manner which also creates jobs, because if there is a massive unemployment problem, then our economy will continue to flounder. There is no easy way to go about this, and government will have to do its bit, especially at a time when the economy is sort of slowing down and sort of continuing to struggle. Some one economic agent has to break the shackles, and that economic agent invariably turns out to be the government, because it's not always restricted by the budget constraint that you and I or even the companies are constrained with.
And next, we talk about the tussle between the center and WhatsApp. Right now, there are two cases that are going on in the Delhi High Court. Both are center versus WhatsApp, and both have the user privacy at their heart. But Indian Express's Pranav Mukul writes that in these two cases, the difference is that both sides have made arguments that are diametrically opposite to what they have argued in the other case. In this segment, Pranav joins us to talk about the glaring contradictions in positions that both Center and WhatsApp have taken. So, Pranav, what are these two cases between the Center and WhatsApp that you have written about, and where does this tussle between the two start?
So this thing actually begins from a couple of years back when the first time, I think in 2017 or 2018, the government for the first time asked WhatsApp to provide traceability on the platform. It wanted WhatsApp to identify first originators of an unlawful message, of a message that it considers unlawful. But at the time, WhatsApp had said that this would mean that you'd have to break our encryption, and we can't do that.
Basically, all messages on WhatsApp are end to end encrypted, meaning nobody except you and the person you send that message to can read it, not even WhatsApp. And that's really the foundation of the entire platform. So, for WhatsApp to find out the originator of a message, it will have to break that encryption and essentially change the entire model. That's why WhatsApp has been reluctant about this. Now, Pranav explains what led to our first case in question.
So what happened earlier this year was that government came out with a set of intermediary guidelines for social media platforms and messaging platforms, which said that any significant social media intermediary, which means that any platform with more than 50 lakh users, will have to provide traceability on its platform mandatorily. These rules kicked in from the May of 26th this year, which was last month. So in the first case, WhatsApp has filed a case in the Delhi High Court challenging these guidelines, saying that this requirement of traceability is unlawful. That's what WhatsApp says.
Okay, so this is case number one, where, like you said, WhatsApp has challenged the government's traceability guidelines. What is the second case?
So in the second case, which was actually filed before this one, a PIL was actually filed against WhatsApp's new privacy policy update that was announced by the company in January this year. So in that privacy policy, what WhatsApp says is that they were detailing out how it collects and stores and shares data with its Facebook group of companies, something that they did back in 2016, but they're just being more transparent about it. That's what it claims. And this new privacy policy has been challenged by a resident of Noida, and in the PIL, they've said that this policy actually violates privacy. So these are basically the two cases where both Center and WhatsApp have been caught in. In the PIL case, actually, center was asked to respond by the court. That case was not exactly filed by the center, but center has been asked to respond to the PIL, and it has filed its response in the court.
And when we talk about these cases, user privacy is at the center of them. But in both cases, Center and WhatsApp seem to be making arguments that you write are diametrically opposite from what they are making in the other case. So could you talk about how this seems to be happening?
Essentially, in case against WhatsApp, which is against its user privacy policy, what Center has said is that what WhatsApp is doing is violating something called informational privacy. So informational privacy is something that gives the authority to a user to decide how his or her data is shared and how the information pertaining to that user is being shared. So this is what the center is arguing against WhatsApp. And in its own case, where it's asking traceability, there WhatsApp is challenging the traceability requirement on the basis of the Supreme Court judgment in the Puttaswamy case, which laid down the sort of recognized the fundamental right to privacy. And among the various kinds of privacy that the Supreme Court recognized, informational privacy was one. So again, Center's own decision is being challenged, among others, on the same part. So that is one thing. And the second thing where the government has challenged WhatsApp's new user privacy policy update is by saying that WhatsApp has brought this to India and it is discriminating against Indian users because it hasn't come out with the same policy update in Europe. But the fact of the matter is that, and what WhatsApp is also arguing, is that Europe has a general data protection regulation which does not allow it to bring this policy, whereas India does not have a personal data protection law which would prohibit WhatsApp from doing so. So these are some of the contradictions where both of these sides are caught.
Right. And one thing you also point out in your piece is that both these cases are in the same court and are likely to run parallelly. But, talking about these cases, what implications do they have for users, considering it is their privacy that is at stake here?
So in the beginning, when WhatsApp brought out the privacy policy, it said that it told users that, accept this policy by a certain date or you lose access to WhatsApp. When there was a lot of protest against its privacy policy, it extended the deadline and said that you won't lose access to WhatsApp, but you'll lose certain functionalities. And then later it said that, okay, fine, don't accept it. We'll keep reminding you to accept it. And you also won't lose any functionality. So there's this one argument of coercing users into accepting its privacy policy, accepting what it wants to do, how it wants to monetize its platform, and which is something which WhatsApp argues most tech platforms do. So that is one thing. And on the other hand, where the government's IT guidelines have been challenged, that is actually the first real world test of the fundamental right to privacy on a judicial platform, and that will just set out the future precedent for how right to privacy is viewed by the courts.
And also just getting a bit more into the case against WhatsApp, where it is asking users to accept this new privacy policy, there have been concerns regarding users' metadata being shared. Could you talk about those concerns a bit?
So what WhatsApp is saying is, despite its new policy update, this does not actually change how it shares data with Facebook group of companies, WhatsApp being owned by Facebook. And WhatsApp says that despite this, it does not break encryption. So all the messages still remain encrypted. Only the sender and the receiver can see those messages, barring, of course, if someone decides to take a screenshot and share it somewhere. But only the sender and the receiver can see the message. But what happens is that obviously it won't be able to read messages, is what it's claiming. But there's always some metadata. Metadata is essentially data of data. So anything that identifies you that WhatsApp can see, which is your name, how many groups are you a part of, what time did you send a particular message, not the content of the message itself, but what time did you send a message. So the data pertaining to all these data points that WhatsApp can collect, and if it decides to, it can share it with Facebook group of companies for commercial purposes.
And on the other side, when we talk about the government wanting traceability from WhatsApp, wanting to know the original sender of a message, it says it is doing that for the safety of citizens, to fight misinformation, to put a stop to rape videos and child sexual abuse content. But by getting this access, by knowing who has sent a particular message to which person, what concerns does it raise for WhatsApp users?
So in this case, while there's one safeguard that the center has provided, is that traceability of message should be used as a last resort measure to figure out who the originator of an unlawful message is. But what WhatsApp is arguing in this case, that it cannot predict which message a government wants traced. So first it will have to store all the messages that have been exchanged on its platform in this country, and it will also have to provide a identifier to every message. So that essentially means that so whenever the government seeks for the originator of a certain message, it must be able to identify that message in the first place. So that would sort of mean breaking the encryption. How it does is it attests a hash number to the message, which is basically a encrypted code, and it can identify the message through that code. So if they have the code of the first message, it will remain same throughout the chain through which it has been forwarded. That way it can identify the originator, but for that we'll have to provide these identifiers to this message, which will make just accessing anybody's message more susceptible. That's what WhatsApp is arguing again, that if traceability is brought in, it will take away the benefits of encryption.
And in the end, we talk about the Madhya Pradesh government. The Indore bench of the Madhya Pradesh High Court has now issued a notice to the state government regarding its alleged negligence in curbing communal clashes that took place in Ujjain, Indore, and Mandsaur earlier this year. These clashes had taken place during the donation drive of funds for the construction of Ram Temple in Ayodhya. The notice issued by the court seeks the response of the state government in the matter within 6 weeks. The bench of Chief Justice Mohammad Rafiq and Justice Sujoy Paul was hearing a petition filed by the Rajya Sabha MP and former Chief Minister Digvijay Singh, in which he had moved court to issue directions to the state to enforce a Supreme Court ruling in cases of mob violence, communal violence, and mob lynching. Back when these communal clashes had taken place, we had done an episode that discussed in detail what had happened in 3 such incidents. In all 3 of them, rallies were carried out by Hindu right-wing groups through either Muslim-dominated or communally sensitive areas. Hindu chants and slogans were raised, and in some cases houses were ransacked and Muslim places of worship were attacked. And then stone pelting and clashes took place between those participating in the rallies and the residents of the area. Also, after one incident, the police had demolished an entire house of a person, even though it had no concrete evidence that the person had done anything. We have provided a link to that episode in today's show notes. You were listening to 3 Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.